Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here, to welcome all of you to this very special event. It's always a privilege to welcome back to campus, and this time for a special conversation with philanthropic leader, health economist, physician, author, Dr. Rajiv Shah, on his new book, Big Bets: How Large-Scale Change Can Really Happen. And Dr. Shah, it's an honor to welcome you back to the Hilltop since your service as Distinguished Fellow in Residence with the Global Human Development Program and the School of Foreign Service, and we thank you for your presence, and we look forward to hearing your reflections in just a few moments. Joining Dr. Shah in conversation this afternoon will be Gail Smith, CEO of One Campaign, an organization dedicated to fighting extreme poverty and preventable diseases. Gail joined us in 2016 during our McCourt School of Public Policy commencement, when we were honored to present her with an honorary degree. So Gail, it's wonderful to have you back at Georgetown. This afternoon, we've come together to hear Dr. Shah's insights on how we can pursue impactful change in our world. His new book, Big Bets, published just this month, explores the possibilities of large-scale change by inviting us to ask simple, straightforward questions, weaving together personal experiences from his work to help vaccinate 900 million children through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to his leadership in the response to the West African Ebola pandemic. Dr. Shah reveals the power in utilizing a big bet mindset to solve problems boldly. Now, as president of the Rockefeller Foundation, a global institution with a mission to promote the well-being of humanity around the world, he has championed innovation as a means to improve health for women and children, to create sustainable food systems, and to enable meaningful economic mobility in the United States and across the globe. In 2009, he was appointed by President Barack Obama as the 16th administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. And during his 5 years in this role, leading nearly 10,000 staff in more than 70 countries, he worked to build new public-private partnerships to end hunger and create more opportunities for justice. He's also served as Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics, and Chief Scientist in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where he launched the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. During his 7 years with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he worked in various capacities, serving as Director of Agricultural Development, Director of Strategic Opportunities, and as Deputy Director of Policy and Finance. And in those roles, he helped to launch the Foundation's Global Development Program and establish the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa and the International Finance Facility for Immunization. In 2015, as I mentioned earlier, he joined our community as a Distinguished Fellow in Residence, where he reunited with his former colleague, Steve Radelet, Director of our Global Human Development Program, focusing on global economic development issues. Dr. Shah has also been a member of the National Security Council. He has served as a member of several boards of governance, including the Seattle Public Library and the Seattle Community College District. He's the founder of the private equity firm focused on power and infrastructure projects in Africa and Asia, Latitude Capital. Throughout his career, he has devoted his efforts to large-scale humanitarian projects, and his new book provides an opportunity for all of us to benefit from his expertise and his reflections on leadership, on solving complex problems in manageable segments, and on the contributions each of us can make to bettering our world. And to join Dr. Shah, we're glad to have as moderator for this conversation Gail Smith, a leading expert on global development and has served 3 American presidents as a top advisor for development issues and global health security. Since 2017, she has served as president and CEO of One Campaign, bringing her breadth of expertise to the organization's mission of fighting poverty and preventable diseases and fostering economic opportunities for people in impoverished contexts. Under her leadership, one has raised $14 billion for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and launched the Vote for Your Future campaign in Nigeria. Prior to her role at ONE, she served as the 17th administrator for USAID, immediately following Dr. Shah. Before working in government, she lived and worked in Africa for more than 20 years, spending much of this time as a journalist, covering stories on the wars in Eritrea and Ethiopia, and covering economic and political issues in the region. So Raj Shah and Gail Smith, thank you for being here for this conversation. Would you all please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Rajiv Shah and Gail Smith. Thank you very much. Very much. Thank you, Jeff.
Hi. So before we get started, and I feel like I'm projecting rather dramatically, I think one of the things that both Raj and I know and that he writes about a lot is that if you want to win a big bet, you got to have a good team. And as two former USAID administrators, I just want to take a second to give a shout out to all the people here who are now serving or have served at USAID, because anything we're going to talk about and anything that gets done that's a big win and a big bet wouldn't happen without you. So thanks to all of you. Raj and I have worked together for a long time, including on some of these big bets. There will be some amusing moments here, for sure. But Raj, let me ask you to take a step back and think about the moment we're in now. I want to start in your present, right? You're at Rockefeller Foundation now. If you're thinking about big bets today, doing what you've done, knowing what you know, what are the big bets you think that are worth placing today?
Well, first, let me just say it's really special to be here. I had a chance when I left USAID, thanks to President DeGioia and to Steve Radelet and Dean Hellman, to be able to teach here. And I met many of the students back then, and it just kept me on my toes, and it also kept me inspired about the future. And I wrote this book because I really want myself to remain deeply optimistic, and I want young people in particular to be super optimistic, especially when it's tough, that some of these big bets can make change happen and can really make the difference in the lives of so many. So it's special to be here. I want to thank Jack in particular. Thank you for your friendship over many years and hosting us today. And Gail, a special thank you to you. This should be fun. And I told Gail I'm going to ask her questions too, because I can see our friends smiling because they know this is going to be fun. And I'm excited to have this conversation because as you know, we've been on this shared mission together for a long time, some ups and some downs, but always together, and that's pretty special. So thank you for doing this.
No, delighted.
Big bets right now, well, the big bet at the Rockefeller Foundation is around energy and the climate transition, and we really fundamentally believe that this is a really unique moment in history where actually the wealthiest economies in the world are already investing trillions of dollars in public subsidy to green their economies, and the technology frontier that's creating is going to create jobs, it's going to create competitive advantage, it's going to create a lot of value. And unfortunately, that's not happening in 70, 80 countries around the world that house, for example, the 3.6 billion people that live in productive energy poverty or consume less than 1/12 of the energy and electricity we consume here in the United States. And of 20 years of renewable energy deployment around the world, less than 1% of it's been in Africa, despite the fact that 50% of the landed solar radiation on Earth is in Africa. And I feel like if we don't make bold decisions now and put together the unlikely partnerships that make big bets work to solve that problem, to make sure that everyone gets access to the renewable energy technology frontier, we will miss the opportunity to address large-scale poverty reduction, to improve the productivity and the income that comes off of farming and agriculture, and to bring some degree of equity to this global climate transition that is obviously urgent and existential. So that's where we're putting our resources right now.
So that's like huge, right? That's a big bet. Let me take you backwards, because you write in the book about your time at USAID and some of the big bets then. And one of those was Power Africa, which we worked on together. And I think it was actually brilliant, because I think we came up with something that took resources across government and leveraged them together in a way that brought about real results. Say something about Power Africa and how it was built, and what's your takeaway from that? What did you learn from that experience?
Well, what I learned from that experience was actually the work you led, that we all did together at the time, which was just asking ourselves, what are the fundamental constraints to growth and inclusive growth in economy after economy after economy? And because this was a whole-of-government effort, it brought together the analysts from the World Bank and Millennium Challenge and all these other platforms together with Eric Postel and our team that kind of led on our side. And the obvious conclusion was energy. It was where the price of energy was high or where the supply of energy was erratic and unreliable, you simply couldn't create jobs, you couldn't have inclusive growth, and you couldn't achieve the goals we otherwise set. And you know what's interesting is 10 years later, after that work we all did, the Oxford Multidimensional Human Poverty Index indicates that it is in fact energy access that is the most cross-cutting intervention for reducing poverty at scale. And so it's some pieces of knowledge emerge over time, but that was the big finding. The other big finding, of course, was that we have the capacity to help people get access to energy. I mean, you remember the reason we started Power Africa was President Obama was saying, gosh, every leader who shows up says, what I really need is energy and energy infrastructure, and there's nowhere to go but China to get support for that. And the Chinese support is low-cost financing for coal and heavy fuel oil. And we want a different path. And so that led to the work that ultimately created Power Africa. And I'm really proud of that effort. I see some of our colleagues that contributed to it. And it started to bring a public-private model together for how we can do development right. And I write in the book a number of times about whether it's on hunger or on bringing electricity to low-income communities or even expanding access to immunizations, figuring out how to bring the public sector and the private sector together is where the magic happens.
I think that's right, and I think figuring out where the gaps are and trying to fill them, because one of the things, and there are many people here who played a role in this, it was knitting together all the tools we had and figuring out what's the glue. And that was to realize something very, very big, and we had a lot of skeptics at the front end.
And I'm going to ask you this question, because when you were leading USAID after I left, you actually worked with Congress and passed the Electrify Africa Act. And I'm curious how it seemed like there was strong bipartisan support for that, right? Why do you think that's the case when there's so little bipartisan support for anything these days?
I'll tell you an interesting story, and Raj, you know this from your own experience of learning. I'd recommend there's a great Politico piece about Raj in this book, and there's a learning experience embedded in that about how you think you're making a really good point. Oops, you realize mid-sentence this isn't working, and how you correct it, which was your journey of building bipartisan support for what you were doing at USAID. So an interesting story. So we do Power Africa, and it's actually generating deals. Basically, what we were trying to do is use all the tools we had across the US government. There were tons of really good projects in Africa, but they weren't meeting. So we tried to figure out how we could kind of introduce them and have the people in between that could realize these deals and generate electricity. And the one campaign I will say is a plug played a huge role in also getting Electrify Africa passed, which what that did was took something that was an initiative of one president and conveyed it into law so that it's not just President Obama's initiative. We had an event, I think I can talk about this now because all these members of Congress have left, but we had an event at Blair House to thank everyone, and when Electrify Africa passed the Congress. And we had Republicans and Democrats. This was the Obama administration, so Democratic administration. And the Democratic and Republican chairs of the relevant committees all spoke. And it was no press event, which is probably why it was so frank. And all of them got really choked up. And they said, you know, this is what we should be doing here. We should be working together to change people's lives. And by that time, we had tangible measurement of lives that had been changed, places the lights were on, homes and schools that had electricity that hadn't before. And I'd say two things. I think, unfortunately, it took the privacy of that room for grown men, and they were all men, but grown men to get really emotional about the fact that it felt really right to be doing the right thing. Yeah. And I think the space for that has narrowed. Now, maybe you do want to tell the story about the bipartisanship, because I think there's also, look, there's tons of lessons in this. This is a really good how to think about big bets, but how to then pursue them. And one of the ways you have to do that is you got to bring people along with you. I mean, the thing I was told when I became USAID administrator, and it's very true, you got to carry the building if you want to do anything. If you want to have a budget, you got to carry the Congress. So talk about that.
Well, there's a chapter in the book called Make It Personal. And this, especially for students, I hope this is a helpful lesson because I learned, as I do often, the hard way. You know, if you remember in the first term under President Obama, we lost the midterm elections, and the Tea Party had sort of become a prominent political force on the Republican side of the House. And the first bill proposed by the new Congress was called H.R. 1, and it would have zeroed out the budget for USAID. And we were legitimately worried, not that we'd necessarily kind of have to shut down, but that the cuts would be so draconian and so steep that we'd effectively lose a lot of our momentum. And so I have a couple of chapters in the book are about my learning from Bill and Melinda Gates in those days, but I'll just summarize that by saying it was all very quantitative. So I showed up and I told my team, okay, do a really intense quantitative analysis on what's the impact of this going to be. And the team did excellent work. And it turns out if you add cuts to the malaria initiative, cuts to the vaccination initiative, cuts to maternal to child transmission programs in PEPFAR and HIV/AIDS, you end up with about 70,000 kids that would have lost their lives according to that analysis. So I trot out to Capitol Hill and boldly proclaim that H.R. 1, this Republican bill, would kill 70,000 kids. And,
I'm like watching this on C-SPAN going, either that's going to be really good or that's really, really bad.
And the truth is it was both. So I come back to the office and I start getting like congratulations from some of our outside partners and even some folks in the White House are like, it's about time somebody, really hit them hard. And then a few hours go by and I get a phone call from Tom Vilsack. And Tom is currently the Secretary of Agriculture, was also then the Secretary of Agriculture. And he called and said, Raj, I was just with Speaker Boehner, and he was very offended by what you said. And you need to go see him quickly and just talk to him about it. So I trotted up to Capitol Hill, met with the Speaker, met with his Chief of Staff, someone named Barry Jackson, who said, we've spent decades building a coalition of support on the Republican side for USAID, for the humanitarian mission America represents around the world. And we've done it by engaging with faith-based conservative Republicans, and your comments are quite offensive, and you should go and meet. And he gave me a list of like 30 people. I saw Barbara here earlier. Like we we went on a mission to go meet and get to know everybody. And that led to some really shocking and unexpected friendships, including with Jim Inhofe, the former senator from Oklahoma, with whom, he's adopted a child from Ethiopia. He's a deeply passionate person about fighting hunger in Africa in particular, even though he's the person who brought a snowball onto the floor of the United States Senate to explain that climate change is not real and it's still cold outside. But in the privacy of his office, as you said, when the doors are closed, we prayed together, we talked about our values, we expressed our vulnerabilities, and he ultimately invited me to join something called the Senate Prayer Breakfast, which led to an invitation to be the keynote speaker at something called the National Prayer Breakfast. And the point was, I think over a number of years, we built not only kind of really deep, authentic relationships. When Jim and I were traveling in Ethiopia, and actually our car got stuck in a rainstorm in the mud, and he's like, "Everybody who's under 70, get out and push." And I was like, "Really?" I did. But the point was, it led to real important collaborations, including passing the Global Food Security Act on a bipartisan basis, including not just saving the USAID budget, but doubling the size at the time of our DLI, or Development Leadership Initiative, which people didn't expect we could sustain, and including a number of other times when he and that community of partners stepped in to help us advance our mission. And it taught me, make it personal, like sometimes even far more important than being the smartest person in the room is having a depth of understanding of your counterparts or colleagues.
I think that's right, and I think it's find the one thing you can agree on. I mean, I disagree enthusiastically with a lot of members of Congress that I engage now and did when I was in government. And you can put all that to the side if you can find just one thing that you agree on. So Raj, you're a big believer, okay, you go for these big bets. Something you write about in the book, which I think people might be surprised by, is failure. And you and I used to joke about how it'd be really fun to have a failure summit. Seriously, and have a summit or a big conference where everybody comes with the biggest dud that they had ever come up with. You write about a big failure in the book. I have a prop. This failure was so spectacular that it yielded a coffee cup that says, "I'm a dreamer, I have to dream and reach for the stars, and if I miss a star, then I grab a handful of clouds," which is a quote from Mike Tyson. The story behind this is one of failure, and I think one of the really important lessons to learn is it's okay to fail. And if you don't fail sometimes, you're probably not trying hard enough. But you succeeded a lot. So, okay, what happened when then, oops, you failed?
Okay, well, this is many of you were a part of this, but this was the Inga Dam project, which when we were pursuing Power Africa, we always wanted to find something big we could do. And coming out of the Sunnyland Summit between President Xi and President Obama, which was, 2012, 2013, there was a sense that China and the US should do something big together, especially around development, to demonstrate that these rising powers could collaborate for the good of humanity. This was before a significant deterioration, obviously, in the relationship over many years. But anyway, we somehow got in our idea that we should pursue this, and I was the biggest advocate in the US government for it, that we should pursue this big hydropower project in the Democratic Republic of Congo called the Inga Dam. And in its largest form, it would have generated 40 gigawatts of power at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. It would have provided electricity to 250 million people. The cost would have been split between China and the US and multilateral development banks, the World Bank in particular. And we had kind of a dream plan for how to keep it safe, secure, not corrupt, effective, environmentally sound, et cetera. And I was like all these big bets that I write about in the book, and some have worked, thankfully. These are intense, high energy, opportunities and requirements. And along the way, the whole thing just fell apart. And I didn't hear the warnings, even though Gail provided them and others provided them.
Desperately.
But I was so relentlessly can-do about it that I was like, oh, we'll just solve that when we get to it. And one day, someone came in my office and said, oh, Pat Leahy just passed a rule in the Senate that says we can't do hydropower dams anywhere in the world. And so this project is simply not going to happen. And the United States basically voted absent on the major vote for the project in the World Bank process, which effectively kind of killed the effort to mobilize resources and make it happen. And I write about it because, frankly, it was a very personal failure. I mean, I was very committed to it. I'd done a lot of analytics on it and really bought into why it could work and why it could be transformational at scale. And I was putting a lot of the lessons I've learned into practice to try to make it happen. And it just sort of died in that moment. And the lesson I draw from for you and readers of the book and for myself on reflection was know who you're betting on. And what I hadn't done at the beginning of that effort was really pause, listen, and say, this is going to be an insurmountable roadblock, or this is going to be something we'll never overcome. I actually write about this in the book, but a few weeks after the Senate passed the provision that effectively stopped the project, we had our first African Leaders Summit. And it was at the State Department, this very significant 50 African leaders, just a huge gathering. And President Kabila of the DRC sort of pulled me aside and had a private conversation with me that reinforced in my mind that pursuing this project never, even if the Senate hadn't killed it, would never have taken place with the ethics and standards and transparency that we would expect to conduct ourselves with. And people had warned me about Senator Leahy and the environmental lobby, and people had warned me about President Kabila. I just hadn't listened. And so to me, the lesson is know who you're betting on, listen to advice about the people who are mission critical to these efforts, and move forward. And I will say, because I want people to appreciate, if you don't try to do big things, you'll always fail. In this case, almost weeks after this was a failure, and it really was pretty bad. Like, I remember waking up and reading on the front page of the FT, the Financial Times, about how this thing fell apart. And but within a few weeks, the same team, multi-agency, was back together in this all-out push to fight Ebola in West Africa, literally weeks later. And that project, I think, is one of the grand successes in this book.
Let me just say something here, because I think, if you fail, you just got to fail fast. You got to learn from it. And if you don't learn from it, that's a bigger failure than the failure itself. But I also want to give you credit for something else. When you fail, if you can own it, you've got a better chance of succeeding on your other big bets. And I think when you told me about this book and you said you were going to include Inge in it, I sort of cracked up. I was like, what? You're going to put Inge in it? And it went back to something you had said early on when we started working together, which is, if we're going to get this right, if we're going to be exciting and bold and creative, there are going to be some failures. So read that chapter, because it's really important, but then also recognize that this guy just sat up here and said, hi, let me tell you about my biggest failure, which, good on you. And the biggest failure went into one of the most exciting, extraordinary moments that I can recall when we were in government, which was the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And I don't know if I can recreate the kind of fear that there was across the government. There had been a couple cases in the US, but our colleagues from the Center for Disease Control had what we called the hockey stick graph, where they had projected what would happen if this went unchecked. And it went kind of like this and then straight up. And it was, with mobility and travel, this wasn't going to stay in West Africa. Ebola is a really, it's hemorrhagic fever. It's a horrible, horrible death and wildly contagious. So you come into the administration, it's like, hi, welcome to your new job at USAID. Haiti just cracked into an earthquake. You went through, I don't know how many humanitarian crises. Then we get to Ebola. Tell the story of that and what your takeaways are.
Well, Gail, you were just an extraordinary force for good on Ebola. And I remember during the summer of 2014, as what was a small rural outbreak of Ebola that seemed to have been contained the prior spring exploded, probably in retrospect because of a genetic mutation, into a much more contagious and much more rapidly moving urban outbreak with a 70% mortality rate. And as you mentioned, it's a hemorrhagic fever, so people are bleeding. It's a horrific way to pass. And the Liberian community health workforce had lost many of its service members because they couldn't keep themselves safe in caring for people. And in that moment, the CDC basically projected the 1.6 million cases might occur and be spread all over the US. It was like it is now, October. It was September, October. And it became political. It's the first time I remember Donald Trump being a political presence, but he was commenting pretty aggressively along with Chris Christie and a number of other members of the Republican Party at that time about how we should not go anywhere near West Africa and we should cut ourselves off and stop flights. And I remember once you and I were in the National Security Council and we're like, who flies to Liberia? As if there's like a direct flight. And then they were like, oh, there are no flights. We're like, what flights are we going to cut off? It was crazy. But we were in these intense discussions about what to do. And basically the White House, led by Gail and Susan and Lisa Monaco and ultimately President Obama, made the big bet, which was basically for the first time in our history, America would deploy service workers, our US military, into a hot zone to fight a pandemic. And I write about this in the book, that we created a policy framework that would have American service personnel doing safer activities and leave the task of hot zone activities to the USAID humanitarian partners and some members of the public health workforce coming out of HHS, the Health and Human Services. But the bottom line was, and the chapter title is called Keep Experimenting, because when we made the big bet, we actually didn't know how to fight Ebola. The common way to do it came from 40 years ago, which was isolate someone who's positive, hope for the best, and then that's what you do across everyone who's positive. And so we went in and started building these big Ebola treatment units, but nobody would go to those Ebola treatment units because no one ever came out. If you went to an Ebola treatment unit, your ashes were never even returned to your family. Your possessions were incinerated, and no one came out. So obviously no one was going to go in, but we didn't know the alternative. And so we created a scorecard, like a dashboard. And I remember it was a deeply negotiated document between USAID and CDC. It ultimately played out. It was actually drafted at my kitchen table one day by teammates that came from both organizations and sat at the table. And it allowed us to have a number of different things we were going to try and experiment with, and then evaluate the data on what would work. And ultimately, what finally worked was a group called Global Communities, working with local organizations, identified that it was at the point of washing and treating with respect the bodies of the deceased in rural Liberia, that's where the maximum contagion was. So they constructed these burial teams that were full head-to-toe protective equipment. They went in with burial bags. They conducted kind of safe and dignified removals of these deceased persons, and we saw the contagion go down by about 70% thereafter. And ultimately, instead of 1.6 million cases, there were 30,000 cases. And as Gail, you noted, instead of widespread Ebola in the United States, there were 2 cases, and I think neither were actually transmitted inside our borders. And so it was really a tremendous success story for those of you and us together on this mission. And I think it only happened because of the discipline of data, experimentation, trusting local partners, and keeping an open mind in the context of a very big bet.
Yeah, and you know, this, like, which one is not like the other ones, right? Ebola is a bit different than some of your other examples, because the big bet there was that if you could experiment, drive with data, and iterate, you would find a solution. But this is like trying to figure out how to put out a fire while you're in it. So that was the bet. That was the big risky bet. And I just want to give a plug for something else that was done at this time. You know, in the Ebola treatment units, which were scaled down, and not very many people came out, but some did. But the healthcare workers had to wear these suits that were really, really heavy, thick rubber and sealed entirely. And they could only work for, I think it was like 40 minutes.
So you get so hot that you...
Because it got so hot, they had to take a break. And on the day that we announced that President Obama announced that he was deploying the military, which was a crazy, I mean, this was decided very quickly. This was decided on a weekend. On the Tuesday morning, we were in Atlanta going to CDC, where the president made the announcement. But one of the things he noted there was that these suits were so heavy, and it was crazy that these healthcare workers, and there were healthcare workers from all over West Africa. Africa deployed thousands of healthcare workers. American healthcare workers were deployed by the US government, by NGOs, were just insufferable, and sort of said, Raj, can you do something about it? And in that iteration, you did one of your grand challenges and came up with what we called the spring Ebola suit, which was the lighter Ebola suit, which allowed medical personnel to work for a much longer time. So it's like some big bets are really big things.
And it also had a zipper that
Yes.
you could take off, because people were getting infected when they would touch their goggles and through the mucosal membranes. That's where a lot of the healthcare infections happen.
It was a game changer.
It was safer.
It was much safer. It was much lighter. But it was part of that, you know, like building a plane while you're flying it, right? And that's a kind of big bet.
Yeah, and that's why the chapter to me is called Keep Experimenting, because I find when we were at our best, and when we are at our best now, we're able to build real experimental process into the system. I know, because I've spent time with Professor Radelet's students, that there's a lot of data and analytics in the coursework, and I think that's appropriate, because to do this work well, you have to kind of constantly study what's working and what isn't working and make those judgments very quickly.
I think that's right, but I want to pull a thread on something you said earlier about the failure, which is that the quantitative is really important. You want the data to be able to make your case, to test yourself, to go to the next iteration. But to get a big bet done, you've also got to have the qualitative, because you've got to carry people along with you. Now, let me ask you a different question. You will recall, Mr. Shah, that when I was at the White House, and Margie Sullivan is here and she'll remember many a phone call, and you were at USAID, if you're a big better, one of the things that makes you a big better is you got a lot of ideas. And this guy has a couple hundred ideas every day. And seriously, I mean, seriously, I would get on a call with Raj that was about Ebola or something here, and by the end of the call, he'd say, hey, wait, I have one idea I want to run by you. And he'd have 6, right? So it's like there's big bets, there's gambling addiction. It's like, stop. But it is part of the way you come up with the big bets, is you got to have a lot of ideas. Some of them will pass muster, some of them won't. But there are a couple things that come out of that. Like if part of your message to people is go for the big bets, but also have the big, bold ideas, how do you sort them out so that you know what is the big bets that are worth placing, right?
Yeah.
How do you do that? Because if you don't, you've got the risk of the big unbaked bet. Yeah. And that's not going to be helpful over time. So how do you sort that out? And as you look back on what you've done so far, because you're still very young and you are going to do many other things, how do you sort them out?
Well, I write in the book about some of the early days at the Gates Foundation, where to the extent that, big bets is a way to think about solving big global problems, I would say I learned it from a group of people, Bill and Melinda Gates, Patty Stonecipher, Sylvia Matthews at the time, now Burwell, that were very much putting that foundation together in its earliest days. And the main difference between, in my view, a big bet and what we often do in this field of work is the difference between saying, I'm determined to come up with a solution to a problem at scale, as opposed to I'm content with doing good enough because the work is doing good. It's the difference between really being disciplined about what can work at scale and saying I'll take an incremental or piecemeal approach because this is about doing good. And that's the piece I wanted to really delineate in the book. So the first 2 chapters are actually called Ask a Simple Question and Jump First. And they're both about the time with Gates. And, those early days, Bill and Melinda had read an article in the New York Times that said 600,000 kids die every year of rotavirus, the disease. We all get rotavirus, by the way, but none of us, thankfully, perish because we're well-nourished and we live in a country that has modern medical infrastructure accessible to us. But that wasn't the case everywhere in the world. And the world at the time, like 2001, was rolling out a new rotavirus vaccine, but it was only going to be available in the US. And then it got pulled for a particular reason that's also very US specific. And they thought it's crazy that we have a vaccine, but it's not going to be available in the communities where 600,000 kids die. It's instead going to be available in a place where nobody dies. And so that was the inequity we tried to solve. And we'd sit down together constantly, and Bill would keep asking, how much does it cost to vaccinate every single child on the planet? And I'd be with all these experts, and they would all say things like, it's too hard to ask that question or answer it, it's too complicated and it's too complex. And then he would, be a little more aggressive about the same question, basically, for the next 90 minutes. And it took us a couple of years to actually answer the question. But when we answered it, and I think we said the answer was around $84 per year of life saved at the end of the day, all the analytics and all the work that went into answering it kind of created a roadmap for how one would construct a global alliance to actually vaccinate every child. And that global alliance has gone on to vaccinate 980 million kids. 16 million child lives have been saved as a result of that. It continues onward today, and I think it's one of the greatest gifts to humanity. And it's thousands of people. It's not Bill Gates. It's people all around the world working together to make it happen. But the basic idea that it's not, I don't want the answer to how do I expand immunization in one country or a set of villages or with a particular single product. I want a holistic solution to the problem, and I'm willing to put 4 or 5 decades of resources and effort into tracking it until we succeed. That discipline is the difference between a big bet and something more piecemeal. So that's when I look at how do you choose what to do, it's the projects that have those characteristics, where there's a fresh, innovative solution that has the right scalability, where there are partners that can come together and really make it happen, and where there's a measurement infrastructure that either exists or you can build so you can know, are you successful or not, so you can persist over time. Those are the elements of a big bet, and those are the elements of our big bet on renewable electrification now. They defined how we approach Feed the Future when we built that program in the US government, and I think that way of thinking can help tackle big challenges like climate change and human vulnerability even today.
One of the things you mentioned there that's key, and I find it to be the biggest challenge in this universe called development, is scale. And I think all of us sometimes try to do as much as we can and don't as often or naturally as we should say, what are the alliances I need to build to get something done, right? So in all of these things, Gavi, which is the Global Alliance for Vaccines, Feed the Future, which was a very important, still existent, also codified into law, initiative on food security, Power Africa, all of these things, entailed bringing different players into the room, right? Yeah. And I think sometimes with a big bet, you can have a big bet and you sort of want to be at the center of the big bet, but then somewhere along the line you realize, I'm not going to pull off this big bet if it's just me. So what are your kind of takeaways from that? Of how do you build these coalitions? How do you get different players into the room? You're very good at persuading different players. No, you are. This is a very persuasive person. How do you do that? How do people need to think about that?
Well, there's a chapter about our energy project in the book at the Rockefeller Foundation because we launched an effort called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet that's designed to bring low-cost, distributed, renewable electrification to 1 billion people that still effectively live, believe it or not, in the dark. And that project is succeeding. It's based on all of this work that my predecessors at Rockefeller, not me, put into designing small modular solar systems that can, with battery technology and AI-based remote battery and energy management systems, hit price points that serve very poor customers very efficiently, about 1/3 the cost of diesel generation, for an example. And so when we built it, we had this great project, and we're like, how do we take this to scale? We started attracting partners. We went to a huge power company in India called Tata Power, and we said, can you manufacture this at scale? They ultimately entered into a joint venture with us to build out 10,000 of these systems, reach 25 million people, which for us, we were reaching a few 100,000. So that was a big scale effort right there. And then we put this alliance together about 2 years ago and we put in $500 million. We raised 500 from the Bezos Earth Fund and the IKEA Foundation. And then on the backs of that, raised about another 10 billion in development finance to scale this everywhere. Now it's operational in 22 countries. But the chapter is called Give Up Control. And the reason is, and this is maybe the hardest lesson I've learned over time. We had to take our 40 of our best people and have them exit the Rockefeller Foundation to join this other entity. And ultimately, because we built this alliance, we had to give up control. And so instead of being the person who gets to kind of run this effort, I now get to be the person who's one of 10 board members advising on how to run this effort. And I write about it because, when you really are passionate about something, you care about something, it's hard actually to give up control. It's an emotionally difficult thing to do. I don't think earlier in my career, including in our early days together, I was very good at giving up control. You weren't either, just by my observation back then. And so we would go at it a little bit, right? And I don't know, as I've observed what actually works to sustain these efforts, give up control is an important construct.
It is.
And before we wrap, I do have a question for you, so I'm gonna.
All right, but I want to say one thing about giving up control, because we were talking about this event, and I have to say, Raj and I were laughing so hard we had tears in our eyes that we did tussle over that sometimes. But I think one of the key things about giving up control is that big bets have to be at scale, but they've also got to be sustainable. And you can't sustain any of these things if they're dependent on a single person or the parent of the idea to begin with.
Exactly.
So, I look at the world now, I feel like I've given up complete control.
All right, well, I have a question for Gail, and then I'll answer the same one, because we talked about this earlier.
All right.
Part of I didn't fully appreciate this, but writing a book is also a kind of a personal journey. And so there's a lot of personal narrative in the book about what this experiences have been like for me and my family, and it caused me to reflect a lot on how I got to USAID, how I got to the development mission to begin with, and why that was so important to me to do with my life and career. And you have a very special background that got you into the role of USAID administrator and beyond, now president of One Campaign. And I just think, can you share that with folks in a more personal way?
Sure. So I'd like to say that from the time I was in third grade, I really wanted to give my life to global development and fight for global health. That wasn't the case. I think there were two paths that got me there. One was that after college, I traveled, and I wanted to go somewhere as different as possible on the money I had available. And traveled with my boyfriend at the time, and he turned out to be just terrible. And so I said goodbye to Jose on the beach in Greece and kept going. And I was young enough, and I mean, I look back on some of this stuff, and it was, you talk about big bets. This was crazy. That I could take risks, and I could travel. And I lived in Egypt for over a year, finally got a job doing research on documentary film scripts. That took me to Sudan, and I became a reporter because I saw all of these things happening. I had a good education.
A war reporter.
A war
to be
reporter.
Clear, yeah.
And this was the kind of thing where I would leave Sudan on foot with 250 guerrillas, like GUERRIL, those kind of guerrillas, and walk for 6 months at a time across Ethiopia to cover a war nobody was talking about. But the thing that intrigued me then was I had a good education. I followed world events. I thought I knew what was going on, and I didn't. There were all sorts of things going on. The big turning point for me was the Ethiopian famine, which was in the 1980s, and it was the biggest recorded famine in history. Millions of people died. I was a reporter and then went to work for some NGOs behind the lines because part of the reason there was a famine was because there was a war, and there were in fact 2 wars. And people were dying so quickly that the proposals we ended up writing were for burial shrouds and shovels because we couldn't bury people fast enough. It's estimated that as many as 1 million people died in that famine. And those are all people whose lives could have been saved if it hadn't been politics and a lack of imagination. And I'd say no big bets. There were some big bets towards the end. So that kind of took me on a path. The funny story is that I ended up, I mean, when the president said she served 3 American presidents, I'm like, whoa, how did that happen? When I was at the White House during the Obama administration, I was asked to speak to a group of young women who were visiting the Capitol. There were about 250 of them from all over the country. So I'm talking about what the administration is doing and taking questions, and they said, well, how did you get to where you are? And I started at the beginning because I got to be honest, it was not a vision all my life. It was this bad boyfriend. But then when they left, they tweeted, Gail Smith says break up with him and change the world. Which, if you know anything about White Houses, there's kind of message of the day. That wasn't it. But I think it was, I mean, to sum it up for me, Raj, it was seeing on one planet. Like you could fly from that famine to London where everybody was acting normal.
Yeah.
That kind of grotesque injustice, when we have the capacity and the resources, if we muster the political will, I will fight it for the rest of my life.
Well, one of the themes in the book, and I said my wife is a alumni of Georgetown. I think I said that earlier, but I meant to. And she said, make sure you say this one phrase, which I came to really believe, and as I get to go on college campuses on this book tour, it really means a lot, at least to me, is big bets really do start with betting on yourself. And you bet on yourself when you left Jose in that moment, but you really bet on yourself when you took on the task of, following a passion and pursuing your version of creating justice as a war reporter, putting your life at risk in service of that mission. I write in the book about my far less dramatic story, but I was a kid in suburban Detroit. As you can tell, I'm primarily Indian American, so I was pretty good at school, so I was either going to be an engineer or a doctor, and I tried engineering and then became a doctor, basically. But my passion kind of got stirred when I was young, doing things like policy debate in high school. And then one day, unbelievable to those of us in Detroit, this happens in Washington and New York and these big fancy East Coast cities, but not in Detroit. When Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years, and he came to America, he actually came to Detroit on his tour. And he went to the River Rouge plant, which is a famous old auto plant where Henry Ford created the vertically integrated manufacturing system. And he spoke to auto workers. He went to Tiger Stadium. Are there any Detroit folks in the room? All right, woo! But he went to Tiger Stadium.
Ohio?
Stevie
Sorry.
Wonder, she's Ohio, I'm Michigan. But Stevie Wonder opened for him, and he closed every one of his speeches with the same refrain, which was, he said, "To the people of Detroit, from the people of South Africa, I want to tell you we respect you, we admire you, but above all, we love you." And I thought, how could someone imprisoned for 27 years bring that much compassion broadly to everybody? And I knew then and there that I wanted to do something of service, but honestly, I didn't have the slightest clue how. And I hope, especially if, as a student, if you pick up the book and read it, I hope you will, I hope it just gives people a sense that no matter where you're from, you can be part of this mission yourself.
I think that's a powerful note to end on. You really should read the book because Raj is a good storyteller, and there's some really good stories in there and some good lessons to take away. But I think to sum it up, I think right now in the world, we need big bets more than ever before, and we need to muster the boldness. You said the word compassion, the sort of dignity that Mandela offered all of us. So I hope all of you, like Raj, and those of us who are getting older, not only hope, but kind of beg that all of you will take some big bets. There are big things you can do to change the world. This is a great guide to doing it. And I want to thank my friend Raj and all of our friends here tonight. Read the book. Have a great book tour.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you so much, Bill.